Well, thank you everyone for helping the channel reach 40k subs, and to celebrate I thought I'd finally get round to showing off my Space Marines on the channel. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics for another army showcase. Today I'm just going to share some pictures of my Blood Eagle Space Marines, and talk a bit about how the army has developed over the various editions of 40k, and talk about a few bits with the modelling and painting of some of the miniatures. Space Marines were my first army, as I'm sure it is for many when getting into 40k. I originally painted up some very blotchy looking Ultramarines, back in the days of very bright blue, and of course bright yellow shoulder pads. Improving on my earlier efforts, I then repainted everything in a green colour scheme, before finally shifting to the army as it is today. I think I sold off quite a lot of my green painted Space Marines, but some of them have been repainted to fit in with this army. As you can see, I have amassed a fair few over the years. The initial inspiration for my Blood Eagles Successor chapter came after visiting Warhammer World and seeing some very nicely painted freehand designs on the back of some Rhinos, giving me the inspiration that I needed to paint up a mechanised force of Space Marines and tanks. It was 5th edition at the time, and the 5th edition Blood Angels Codex gave you some really quite interesting rules for vehicles. Basically all Razorbacks and tanks and things counted as fast vehicles, meaning they could move and shoot with heavy weapons very rapidly. So over the next year or so I started building up a force of mechanised infantry and other heavy tanks. The background of the chapter was a Blood Angel Successor, based on the enormous desert planet of Overreach. Due to the exceptionally high gravity of the planet, jump packs don't function very well at all, the skies being ruled by the great eagles that fly above the plains. Accordingly, the Blood Eagles make far greater use of armoured transport vehicles and assault squads fighting on foot, and whenever their homeworld is threatened, they take the unusual defensive approach of allowing the enemy to land within the desert, and then drawing them out into a hit-and-run war of attrition across the planet's vast surface. It was during one such chaos incursion that a great eagle swooped down to kill a foul chaos sorcerer, perched on a spire and invoking a ritual to summon demons onto the planet's surface. It was this event that caused the Blood Eagles to rename themselves from their original designation, the Wings of Sanguinius, and to change their heraldry accordingly. Such a slight to the Primarch was not taken well by the other Blood Angels Successor chapters, and all ties between them have been long severed. Over the years the small armoured force has grown beyond every single Marine having an armoured transport vehicle or tank, but I took the decision to paint up everything under the same banner of the same chapter, just to have a more cohesive look on the tabletop, rather than painting up in other colours. Some of the first miniatures that I added to the army were the Razorbacks and assault squads, which at the time in 5th edition you could take as troops for the Blood Angels. The Razorbacks used to actually have a las cannon and twin plasma gun in place of the las cannon on the right. I've had some recent surgery to adjust that, now you can no longer take them in the main codex. I decided at the start of this army that I was going to go quite heavy on the freehand. In particular, those big white eagles are literally just painted straight out of a paint pot, using grey first and then onto white. Not 100% sure that's the best way, seeing as it does take quite a few layers to actually build up to it, but I will admit that I like the end result. I also decided to give each of the tanks a name as a sort of like number plate thing on the front. I quite enjoyed the idea that you'd be able to easily identify which tank was which purely by the name on the front of the thing. Until the recent Space Marine Codex, these Razorbacks hadn't seen all that much play for a while now, so it was fun to go back and give them a bit of love. Now I had a few more hobby skills under my belt. I managed to take off the turrets so I could magnetise between different options, and also magnetise my Hunter-Killer Missile and Stormbolter so I can swap and change as needed. Here are a few more of the veterans. Before they all used to be armed with bolt pistol and chainswords, now I've magnetised each of the wrists and given them a few extra options, such as being able to take storm bolters and storm shields, which I have used as an experiment to run them as proxy deathwatch in the past. I really do like being able to switch out so many different options, though it can be a little bit hard to remember exactly who's got what options throughout the army, to try and track down the relevant upgrades for the guys that you're trying to run in any one particular game. On the left is one of the examples of the green Space Marines that I had previously. A lot of the veteran Space Marines were painted very similar to this guy, and I think that this guy might be one of the very first Warhammer miniatures that I ever bought in the old 3rd edition starter set. The caption on the right was from the 5th edition starter set, and I think you can tell my painting has come on just a little bit in between. One of the earliest big projects of the army was to get together 3 Baal Predators. I must admit painting all the eagles on these ones was a bit of a chore. They certainly weren't the strongest things in 8th edition, but I have been putting them back on the table a fair bit more recently. Even if their assault cannon and heavy bolter damage isn't the most overwhelming, it's usually pretty guaranteed to at least do some chip damage to whatever they're facing. Also, as the initial armoured push, I painted up a Vindicator and a couple of Predators. I was really quite pleased with how the Vindicator turned out. I think I managed to use some of the lessons on the first few vehicles to make it look just that little bit snazzier. The name Iron Beak felt appropriate as well for an enormous demolisher cannon. Somewhere towards the start of 8th edition, I did get round to finally trying to varnish all of my miniatures. I was trying to make them a little bit more hard wearing, and at least for the vast majority of them it does seem to have done the trick. However, for some reason on this one, the varnish managed to give the tank an absolutely horrific frosting effect, which I still haven't got around to fixing. I believe that just applying a little bit more varnish can get rid of this. I'm going to experiment at some point in the future. It's just a slightly cautionary tale to beware that varnish sometimes can mess up a very nice paint job. Honestly, I have no idea why it happened to just this one and none of the rest whatsoever. As far as I can tell, I didn't really do anything different. Finally, for the main armoured contingent, here we have the Landmated Crusader that I've had for really quite a long time now. He was certainly painted green originally. I think it was one of the first miniatures that I actually painted up for the army. The thing that I was most proud for this one was the freehand eagles on the side. I'm not sure that the top one came out quite as well. These assault Terminators were also fairly long-serving miniatures. They've never been absolutely amazing in terms of rules-wise, but it's certainly good fun to use on the table, what with Blood Angel's rules. With the recent 9th edition points changes, they haven't really done too badly themselves. I can certainly see them being used a fair bit more in the future. I believe these bikes were painted up somewhere around 6th or 7th edition, using those very nice Dark Angel's Ravenwing bikes from the Dark Vengeance box. I did quite a bit of alteration on these guys to allow them to be equipped with special weapons. I quite wanted to run them as grav guns at the time, seeing as they'd just come out and they were really quite good, so I actually wound up buying some Forge World Graviton guns, which seemed to be one of the cheaper ways to actually get your hands on something that was essentially the same thing. I know it's got a bit of a different aesthetic, but I quite liked the idea of them. The chap with the power sword is a more recent addition. He's been serving as a biker captain throughout 8th edition. Next up we have a trio of Landspeeders. I think that these guys were painted up in 7th edition alongside the bikes. I was running them as a proxy Dark Angels formation, which I believe had 2 bike squads and 1 Landspeeder in, and it meant they could turn up on the sides and flanks of your opponent and unleash a whole load of nasty firepower at them. It was the era of Riptides, Wraith Knights and Invisible Death Stars, and the multi-melters and grav guns were really some of the only decent options that I had to fight these guys. They really weren't too bad point for point, but they still met with kind of limited success. Again, I did a little bit of magnetisation on here, so they can be armed with assault cannons as well. I'm tempted to make up some heavy flamers at some point. Here we have Angry Bird the Stormraven. He's big and red and flies through the air and likes to break things. This guy most certainly was not bought for the rules. I just really liked the idea of being able to own a mini Thunderhawk when Games Workshop came out with them. The nice flat armour panels were really good for a bit of freehand, as well as painting the cockpits with a bit of a blending technique. Here I've got a few of the characters that I was using to lead the army throughout all of this. I have already shown off the converted librarians on the left. They were made using the Dark Angel's upgrade frame, and I think they really get the effect across without having to buy a very expensive librarian kit just for a tiny miniature of the same size. The standard bearer chap was actually made to be an objective marker at one point. I'm not sure if it's the most obvious from these photos, but he does have a knife sticking out of his right shoulder pad. This guy clearly hasn't been having such a good day. We've also got an apothecary, a converted tech marine with a servo arm, who I believe was actually converted from a White Dwarf subscription miniature. I was quite pleased with the little eagle designer painted on his face as well. And an old venerable metal space marine commander on the right, who's been around since the very first days of my blue painted ultramarine army. It wasn't until actually quite late in 7th edition that I actually started adding some actual tactical marines to the ranks. I think I had the 1 or 2 that I needed to get by beforehand, but in the times before they'd released the rules for 8th edition, I thought I'd just paint up some fairly general purpose stuff, and they've certainly seen a lot of use in 8th edition filling out Devastator squads, or perhaps just filling out detachments and holding objectives. I also painted up this Rhino at a fairly similar time, again more out of a desire just to paint something vaguely useful and general purpose, and also go back and revisit my previous colour scheme. Though with this one I did conceal a magnet under the top hatch, which later came in a fair bit of use, seeing as I actually managed to make a converted whirlwind turret, which can now be lifted on and off the tank depending on whether I want to field it as a Rhino or as a whirlwind. I think that sometime around this time I also painted up these scouts as well, who are probably the models that I've seen the most games out of anyone in my army. Filling out detachments for cheap and getting troops into the midfield has been incredibly good throughout 8th edition. So certainly a lot of armies have started out with a detachment of 3 units of scouts, filling out a battalion. I was quite pleased with the little numbering system that I did on the squad's right shoulder pads. Perhaps not quite as neat as transfers, and the same with the eagles on the left shoulder pad of everyone, but it certainly gives you a little bit more creativity for doing what you want. Probably the zaniest model in the collection, and also possibly the one that I spent the most time on, was this Space Marine Captain mounted on Eagle, who was very much inspired by Space Wolf Thunderwolves. I quite like the daft idea, and I thought if the Space Wolves are riding wolves, then we definitely have to have a guy riding an eagle. Certainly the most intense modelling that I think I've ever done in 40k. Quite a lot of the feathers on his underside are sculpted out of green stuff. The eagle himself is from the Island of Blood Griffin from Warhammer Fantasy, which I think is also where the captain stole that cape from, and the body is actually from an old toy eagle. The feathers were an absolute nightmare. It was before I had any concept of airbrushing, so every single one was painstakingly blended from black all the way through to white, and it really took a very long time indeed. In game I most commonly use him to represent Mephiston. I know he's a lot bigger model wise, but that usually tends to be a disadvantage rather than an advantage. The only thing that feels very inappropriate is whenever he fails to cast Wings of Sanguinius and his eagle just decides to walk for a bit. Now we've got the influx of Primaris for 8th edition has come in. One of the first things on the painting schedule was painting up a box of Dark Imperium. The models weren't particularly strong by any stretch of the imagination at this point, but I was just enjoying all the new Space Marine models. In general, I've never really had any qualms fielding Primaris side by side with normal Space Marines. Technically they are different things in the fluff, I know they do look a little bit mismatched, but to be honest I'm kind of glad that Games Workshop did it this way myself, seeing as it meant that I could keep on using my old miniatures and also add these new ones as well. After I painted them I thought the Inceptors looked a little bit plain, so I decided to add some little stylised wings to their jump packs, which I think worked quite well with the chapter's theme. Then following Dark Imperium I moved on to painting up some Aggressors, who have certainly been models that have seen a lot of play since the new Space Marine Codex dropped. Just the sheer power of farming out crazy amount of bolt shots is really good fun to use in game. I went quite heavy on these guys, painting up 9 of them. In more recent times, 3 squads of Eliminators have joined the ranks. After the new Space Marine Codex dropped, I was running them as Iron Hand successors with Master Artisans, as very many people were at that time I'll admit, but I was just really enjoying all the crazy amount of rerolls that you get on very small units like Eliminators. They were probably one of the most undercosted units in the game until recently. They really couldn't go too far wrong with them no matter what you were shooting at. I was quite pleased with the magnetisation I did on these guys. They can be swapped out between bolt snipers and las fusils, although I still haven't gotten round to painting up those las fusils, so I'm afraid I don't have any photos. Also continuing to embrace the new Space Marine cheese, a unit of Centurions was a bit of a must. Despite their slowness, I was still including them just walking on foot alongside my Iron Hands gun line. These things really could justify themselves even just as walking hurricane bolters even if the enemy never came close, and of course if they do come close to try and lock up tanks and things, then they were an excellent countercharge threat. Probably for the best for the good of the game, 9th edition points cost seem to have put pay to this tactic, but I'm sure I'll keep on running them as and when. They're definitely a model that I absolutely hated when I first saw them, but I'll admit they've really grown on me, maybe just due to familiarity. Here we have a few more of the characters from Dark Imperium, which took me quite a bit longer to paint up than some of the others. I really enjoyed painting up the Dark Imperium Ancient. Hope that he won't be completely gone and that people will get a chance to get their hands on him as well. He is really quite a nice model. I randomly decided to place the Gravis Captain's Power Sword with a borrowed Custodies Guardian Spear. I was kind of half thinking of running him alongside some Countess Deathwatch as a stand-in Watchmaster, but so far that's never happened at all, so I guess he's just got a far fancier spear for no good reason. These guys were some of my 8th edition character additions to the army as well for the normal size Marines. Blood Angel Smash Captains certainly ruled the roost for a while character-wise, and again they were a really fun unit to use, just jumping into the midst of an enemy formation and smashing everything to pieces with Fatty again, plus Red Rampage, and I really enjoyed them being quite such a menace. The Chaplain was mainly painted just because I really liked the look of the model. That winged jump pack just fit into the army so well I thought, though since the Chaplain's got litanies in the new Marine Codex he's actually seen the table quite a bit more. When the Custodies Codex came out, I very much jumped on the bandwagon and painted up a trio of Custodies Captains on the Dawn Eagle jet bikes. These ones were pretty much 50-50 because I just really like the idea of jet bikes with eagles on them, and they just fit in with the theme of the army quite so well, even if Custodies are more upscale than the rest of the Marines, but also because they were very scary in game. I had a list where I had a huge amount of Valhallan Guardsmen and conscripts advancing towards the enemy, screening for 3 of these Shield Captains and some Blood Angel Smash Captains as well. That was the year that I attended the London Grand Tournament. I think I came 30th or 40th, somewhere around there. I included this guy with a Storm Shield just to represent if he was having a 3+ Invul save from one of the Custodies relics. Another fairly recent acquisition was this Invicta Tactical Warsuit. I was sort of tempted to get 3 of the things as the standard, but I decided to hold my horses and just have the 1. Again, ludicrously undercosted, and even if he died turn 1, it would usually mean that the rest of my army was safe from at least some opponent's firepower. Bought at the same time was this redemptive dreadnaught, which was a bit of a project. I decided I'd quite like to try the rules for a Leviathan dreadnaught in game, but didn't really want to pay the Forge World prices for a Leviathan dreadnaught, and wanted to be able to fall back to a Redemptor if it got nerfed. So I painted up this guy with an absolute ton of magnets in him, and changed around his central plate so it looked a little bit more Leviathan-y, though you can put the standard Redemptor one on it, then converted up a couple of these storm cannon arrays, and traded out his heavy bolters for heavy flamers, to do a fairly convincing job of representing a Leviathan dreadnaught in game. These storm cannons were made from Imperial Knight Twin Icarus autocannons, though I did need 4 for the project, so it wasn't the cheapest in the world. I wound up doing a bit of extra work for them by buying entire Imperial Knights just literally for those parts, and reselling the rest of the Imperial Knights in smaller lots to come out with a slight profit and the storm cannon bits. Possibly not the easiest way, but I wanted something that looked quite convincing. In any case, with all the recent Leviathan shenanigans, it was certainly a really good anchor to build a list around. Even if he was easily outranged, that could often have its positives with the opponent having to fall back a bit. Finally, and somewhat strangely, jump pack infantry are relatively recent acquisitions for my Blood Eagles army. I have run them as proxy a fair bit with guys with chainsaws and bolt pistols, but have now finally got round to adding some sanguinary guard and death company into the ranks. I really do seem to have trouble letting go of my red colour scheme, as I've just painted them both up red rather than their traditional gold and black. Oh well, I guess we're not a very traditional chapter anyway. I quite enjoyed painting the power weapons for these guys, and I did manage to do a little bit of magnetisation. You can swap out some of their weapons, though not all of them. The Death Company are pretty much fully magnetised, as I wanted to be able to try out any combo that I wanted, maybe including giving them storm shields to make them Vanguard veterans, which was another factor in painting them red rather than black. In any case, very nice kits, both the Death Company and Sanguinary Guard. I'm looking forward to adding to their ranks in the future. So that concludes my little walkthrough of my Blood Eagles chapter. They're definitely a fairly slow growing army, they just take so much time to paint and do the hard edge highlighting on all of that power armour. I've also tried to keep them to a slightly higher standard than my Imperial Guard, who I'm a little bit more happy just to spam out and say that's good enough. Certainly looking forward to adding some more bits to them in the future, particularly with all the new releases for Space Marines coming out at the moment. I think some of the Blade Guard veterans and Eradicators will be on the to-do list at some point. Again, a massive thank you to all of you guys for helping me hit 40k subs. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the year making videos. It's going to be interesting to see where 9th edition takes us from now. If you enjoyed the video and you'd like to see some more regular Space Marine Tactics content, feel free to subscribe to the channel, there'll be plenty more to come. And if you'd like to help support the channel, the link to the Patreon page is down in the video description below. It is what gives me enough time to make all of these videos. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.